I overheard my DIL call me an old shrew, so I gave them 24 hours to leave my house. You never feel like a guest in your own home, like every sound you make is too loud. Every breath is too much. Like the people you welcomed in are just waiting for you to finally vanish. Last night, I walked into the kitchen and heard my daughter-in-law call me an old shrew. She laughed. And so did my son. They didn't know I was there. They didn't care if I was. They said I was losing my mind, that soon this house would be theirs, that I wouldn't even remember giving it away. But what they forgot is that I still remember everything. And this house still remembers me. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just gave them 24 hours to leave. And that was the moment everything began to change. If you've ever been treated like a burden in the very place you built with love, hit subscribe. The day Elliot called to ask if he and Talia could stay for a while, I was pulling weeds by the rosemary bed in the back garden. It was late March, the kind of Oregon spring morning that carries the last bite of winter but whispers promises of sunlight. My knees ached from crouching too long, and my gloves were damp from the soil. But I remember smiling when I heard his voice. He didn't say much at first, just that things had gotten complicated. Talia was pregnant again. They were trying to get back on their feet after Elliot lost the job at the charter school. Their lease was ending. The numbers weren't adding up. I said yes before he even finished explaining. Of course they could come. The house had more than enough space. The upstairs was barely used since Elliot moved out. And I had always imagined this place echoing with the sounds of children again. They arrived 3 days later in a gray Honda stuffed to the roof. Talia stepped out first, her belly gently rounded under a soft wool sweater and a calm, calculated smile on her face. She called out my name with this soft lilt, as if we were old friends reunited, and wrapped her arms around me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Elliot hugged me harder, longer. I felt the tension in his shoulders, the kind that comes from trying to hold everything together for too long. I patted his back and told him everything would be fine. He nodded, but didn't say much. We settled them into the upstairs guest suite, the one with the skylight that looks out toward the Pine Ridge. I brought out extra linens, reorganized the hall closet, and even cleared out my old filing cabinet so they could have room for baby things. For a few weeks, it was almost lovely. Talia made herbal tea in the mornings and offered to cook dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She complimented my gardening, told me I looked much younger than 75, asked me questions about the books in the den. She had a way of speaking that always felt measured, almost rehearsed. But at the time, I mistook it for charm. Elliot helped with yard work on weekends. He trimmed the wisteria and even tried to fix the screen door that had been hanging loose since the last storm. Jude, their 6-year-old, took to me right away. We'd sit on the back porch and blow soap bubbles while Talia napped. He called me Nana, and I felt something in my chest soften every time. I started making plans. I dug up the old rocking chair from storage and placed it in the corner of the sunroom. I ordered a baby blanket set online and signed up for a class at the community center on infant CPR. There was laughter in the house again, the kind that echoed through the kitchen while we prepared dinner. Jude's giggles as he plays with the old wooden train set Elliot used to love. For a brief moment, it almost felt like those years after my husband passed weren't so heavy anymore. But small things began to shift. Like furniture slowly nudged out of place, Talia started rearranging the pantry, then the living room. She told me it was for better energy flow. She was into something called space healing. I smiled and stepped aside. She began taking over the grocery lists, then the cooking. Then she started labeling the cabinets. Again, I smiled. It was easier. I told myself it was her way of nesting, that maybe this was a good thing. A young woman preparing her home, even if it wasn't hers. Then came the dinners I didn't realize I wasn't invited to. I'd come downstairs to find the three of them eating in the backyard under string lights they had hung without asking. Jude once told me that Talia said quiet time was important, especially for pregnant women. One night, I found the tea cabinet reorganized, all my favorites pushed to the back, replaced with rows of wellness blends and tinctures. I laughed it off, told myself it was just a new generation doing things differently. But when Talia suggested I start using the back entrance so the front door didn't get muddy, I paused. Just a few weeks earlier, I had stood at that very door, arms wide open, welcoming them in. I had given them space, safety, and a home. Now I found myself quietly adjusting to requests that didn't feel like requests at all. Still, I wanted to believe in them, in Elliot, in the idea of family coming back together. I reminded myself that sharing space meant learning to compromise. Maybe I was just too used to being alone. Even Daisy, my old friend from the food bank, noticed I was tired more often. She raised an eyebrow when I told her Talia was managing the finances for now, just temporarily, because it helped her feel secure during pregnancy. "You were the one who raised him alone after Richard passed," Daisy had said, pouring me a cup of weak coffee. "Just don't let anyone manage you in your own house." I laughed, shrugged it off, told her not to worry, because at that point, I still believed my door had always been open for love. I just didn't realize how quickly love could move in, make itself comfortable, and start pushing me out of my own home. I didn't know then that kindness, when mistaken for weakness, becomes a welcome mat for betrayal. And I definitely didn't know that everything would change the moment I heard what they said in that kitchen. But for now, I still believed we were a family, and I was trying so hard to believe that was enough. The first time I noticed something was off, it was the hallway rug. It used to run straight down the center, perfectly aligned with the front door. I had placed it there 20 years ago and never saw a reason to change it. But one morning, it was shifted a few inches to the left. I adjusted it without thinking. Later that afternoon, it was crooked again. The second time, it was the thermostat. I'd always kept the house at 68 degrees, comfortable enough to move around, not too dry for my joints. I came back from the garden and saw it was set to 72. I turned it back. The next morning, 74. No one said anything. There were no discussions, no questions, just quiet decisions made in my own home while I wasn't looking. Talia started using the phrase flow a lot. Energy flow, natural flow, movement flow. One day, I walked into the living room to find my reading chair missing. She had moved it to the sunroom, said the energy in that corner was too stagnant and that spaces needed to breathe. I stood there blinking, holding my cup of tea, wondering when my favorite chair had become a problem for anyone but me. She also had a habit of speaking with cheerful certainty, as if everything she did was backed by some invisible authority that no one could question. Elliot, for the most part, stayed quiet. He smiled when she spoke, nodded along. Sometimes he'd look over at me with that hesitant expression like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Then came the jars. Mason jars, dozens of them, started appearing in the pantry, labeled with her slanted handwriting. Turmeric blend, gut harmony, brain mood. They sat beside my flour, my sugar, the dried beans I always kept for soup. My pantry has become a wellness shelf, and my labels were pushed to the back. At the time, I told myself these were all small things. Preferences. A young woman trying to feel at home during a difficult time. I tried to be generous. She was pregnant, after all. She needed comfort, but it didn't stop there. The music in the mornings changed. I used to start the day with quiet classical radio. But one morning, I walked into the kitchen to find her playing ambient flutes and wind chimes from her phone speaker. She said it helped align the baby's spirit with the sunrise. The scent of the house shifted too. Gone was the smell of fresh coffee and lavender oil I used to diffuse. Instead, the air was heavy with sage and something metallic I couldn't name. One night, I heard her humming softly in the living room. When I peeked in, she was walking barefoot in slow circles, waving a bundle of dried herbs through the air. Jude sat cross-legged on the carpet, copying her movements. I didn't say anything. I just stood quietly in the hallway, watching. Another time, I opened the fridge and found 3 of my soups dumped in the trash. In their place were glass containers of soaked seeds and fermented greens. She said my cooking lacked vibrancy and that gut inflammation could affect emotional memory. Then she offered to make me a cleanse plan, said she had studied holistic gut-brain alignment for mothers and elders. I told her I preferred my own recipes. She smiled and said, "Of course." But the next day, my spice rack had been rearranged. Around this time, Jude stopped coming into my room to read at night. He used to love crawling under the quilt, asking me to read the same book 3 times over. Now he'd peek in, wave, and disappear down the hallway. I asked Elliot about it once, in the backyard while he was trimming the hedge. He paused, clipped too close to the bark, and said maybe Jude needed more structure these days. Said Talia had read something about boundaries being essential for child development. I nodded, though something in my chest pulled tight. And then, one afternoon, I came home from the library to find the bookshelf in the hallway gone. My collection of first edition paperbacks, carefully dusted and organized for years, was boxed up in the laundry room. Talia had replaced it with an altar of sorts, a low wooden table with 3 stones stacked on top, a candle, and a bowl of dried herbs. Above it hung a framed quote about vibrational frequencies and higher paths. When I asked her what happened to my books, she said they were still safe, just relocated for better airflow. She said she was cultivating a peace corner and that clutter often held stagnant emotional weight. Clutter. That word settled in my stomach like spoiled milk. By this point, I stopped offering my opinion. I stopped asking. Instead, I began observing. Every change came in silence. No requests, no permission. Just adjustments, replacements, and the subtle framing that all of it was for my benefit. Talia had a way of speaking to me like I was fragile, like I needed her guidance, her grounding. She'd pat my shoulder when I left a cupboard open, tell me not to worry when I forgot where I placed the scissors, remind me that memory slips were natural at my age. I started writing things down, little things. When I opened the fridge, I left my keys. What day the trash went out. Because deep down, I could feel the shift wasn't just about furniture or food. It was about space, presence, power. And for the first time since they moved in, I began to wonder if I was still the one living in my house or if I had already become the guest. The moment it shifted from strange to cruel happened on a Thursday. I was sitting in the laundry room, folding towels, when I heard footsteps upstairs. Jude had been sick the night before, and I'd left a warm towel by his bed earlier that morning. The boy had barely spoken to me all week, but I still checked on him. As I folded, I heard voices through the ceiling vent. Our house was old, and sound carried oddly between rooms. That vent above the dryer had always brought whispers from the upstairs hallway. Most of the time, it was vague mumbling, but that afternoon, the words were sharp. She called me an old shrew, not quietly, not under her breath. Talia's voice was crisp. The old shrew had no clue, she said, and then she laughed, a short, dry laugh. Then Elliot's voice, lower but not soft. He said I would forget soon enough, that I was already slipping. I sat there, hands paused mid-fold, holding a dish towel I had owned since the year Jude was born. My heart didn't race. It didn't break. It just sank, like an anchor finally giving in to the pull. They kept talking. Talia said it was almost time, that once the baby arrived, they'd have to make things official. Elliot murmured something about the deed, about consolidating, about mental stability. Then she asked him if he had found the old will. He said not yet. But that didn't matter. The house was practically theirs already. That sentence did something to me. Practically theirs. I looked around the laundry room, the shelves I built myself, the paint color I chose to brighten the corners, the window I fixed after the storm in 2014. I had touched every inch of this house with my own 2 hands. And now I was listening to my son talk about it like it was already behind me. They spoke in the language of inheritance before I was even gone. That evening, I made dinner as usual. Roasted chicken, carrots, and rosemary from the garden. Talia didn't come downstairs. Elliot ate half his plate in silence, then carried his fork to the sink without finishing. Jude sat across from me, his head low. I tried to catch his eye. He didn't look up. When he reached for the bread, his hand bumped the butter dish and knocked it to the floor. I bent down to grab it. And when I came back up, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to pity. The kind of look you give someone who doesn't understand they're being left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind knocked softly at the window, and the floorboards creaked like they always had. But for the first time, the house didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt like I was haunting it. The next morning, I pulled out the deed from the lockbox under my bed. It was still there. My name, my signature, my late husband's handwriting, everything still in place. I made a copy and tucked it into my knitting basket, not because I thought they would steal it, but because I had started to believe they already saw me as a ghost. That week, I noticed the medicine cabinet had changed. The supplements I took each morning had been swapped. My vitamin D was replaced with something called Memory Clarity. The labels were neat, a soft purple font. When I asked Elliot if he'd seen my original bottles, he said Talia had read new research and wanted me to try something different. He said it kindly, too kindly, like a nurse soothing a patient. Later that day, I found the printout on the kitchen counter, a medical article with words highlighted. Phrases like early onset, cognitive decline, risk assessment. There was a sticky note on top. Let's talk about this soon. No name. But I knew whose handwriting it was. I didn't bring it up. I didn't argue. I just started writing everything down. In a little notebook I kept in my cardigan pocket. What time I woke up, what I ate, what I cleaned, who I spoke to, what I remembered. I wrote about the butter dish, the conversation through the vent, the missing vitamins. I dated every page. I signed each one. They wanted a case for my decline. I would give them a record of my clarity. And then came the night I found Talia in my bedroom. I had gone out to the garden to cover the basil before the cold snap. When I came back inside, the upstairs hallway was dark except for a sliver of light coming from under my door. I stepped in quietly. Talia was standing by my dresser, holding the photo album I kept from my college years. She was flipping through it slowly, her lips pressed in a line. When she saw me, she didn't jump. She didn't apologize. She smiled, told me she was just checking on something, said she had heard a noise. The album was still open in her hands. I reached out and took it from her. My hand didn't shake. Her smile didn't either. But at that moment, something between us cracked. Not loudly, not like thunder, but quiet, like a seam coming loose. She left the room with a soft goodbye, and I stood there, staring at the open page. A photo of me in a yellow dress, barefoot on a lake dock, 19 years old, laughing. I ran my hand over the image. Not a ghost, not a burden. Me, still here, still watching, still remembering. And from that night on, I stopped hoping they would love me again. I started planning for the day I would ask them to leave. The morning after I found Talia in my room, I brewed my coffee slower than usual. The windows were still dark with dew, and the house held that heavy silence that comes before something breaks. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, the same one I had started weeks earlier. I logged the time. 6:37 a.m. I wrote about the way Talia had stood near my dresser. The way she didn't flinch. The way her smile held nothing behind it. I didn't hear anyone come down the stairs until just before 8. Jude entered first, rubbing his eyes, dragging his feet. I poured him a glass of milk and asked how he was feeling. He shrugged and mumbled something before climbing onto the stool. Then Elliot came in. He kissed the top of Jude's head and nodded at me. Just a nod. No good morning. No mention of what I might have heard the night before. I waited. I waited for a glance that said he knew. I waited for a word, a question, even a poor excuse. But nothing came. Talia didn't appear until nearly 10. She floated into the kitchen with one hand on her belly and the other holding a glass of green liquid. She smiled at me like nothing had happened. Compliment the lavender in the windowsill planter. Told Jude to go brush his teeth. Then she turned to me and said, softly, that she'd like to start taking over the weekly budgeting. Said it would help ease my load. I stared at her for a long moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't protest. I simply said that I prefer to handle the finances myself. She tilted her head like she was studying something fragile, then nodded, said she understood, and that was it. But from that day on, she stopped asking. She began doing things quietly, behind doors, with the certainty of someone who no longer believed she had to ask permission. A few days later, the bank called. A routine check, the woman said, just confirming a recent request to change the mailing address on my account. My heart dropped. I told her no such request had been made. She apologized, said it must have been a clerical error. I hung up the phone and sat still for a long time. When Elliot came home that evening, I asked him if he had tried to forward any of my mail. He blinked at me, then shook his head, said he hadn't touched a thing. I didn't believe him, but I didn't say that out loud. That night, I went into my closet and took out the small fireproof lockbox. Inside were all the documents that mattered. Birth certificates, the deed, my will. I took them out one by one and laid them on the bed. I reviewed every line, every signature. I confirmed what I already knew. I was still in control, legally, on paper. But in the house, I had started to disappear. Meals were made without me, decisions taken without my voice. Conversations happened with doors slightly ajar, always just far enough to keep me out. I started writing everything in sharper detail, not just what I did, but what they said, word for word, tone, time. One night, I wrote down a sentence Talia said while on the phone in the kitchen. She thought I was upstairs, but I had come down for water and stopped when I heard her voice. She told someone she was managing a high-stress environment, that she was monitoring someone with early-stage symptoms. She said the situation was under control, that they were taking steps toward what, she didn't say. I crept back upstairs without making a sound. That week, I asked Daisy to meet me at the park. We hadn't seen each other in nearly a month. She brought me a scone in a napkin and sat beside me on the bench like nothing had changed. I told her about the vitamins, about the labels in the pantry, about the mail, the photo album. She didn't interrupt, just listened with her hands folded tight in her lap. When I finished, she nodded and said one sentence. "You need someone on your side who knows the law." I didn't respond, but I knew she was right. 2 days later, I called a lawyer. Not the one Elliot knew. A woman from town who had helped Daisy with her brother's estate. Her name was Catherine. She was calm, kind, and direct. She listened. She asked quiet, thoughtful questions. She didn't treat me like I was confused. She didn't smile in that way people do when they're trying not to patronize. She took notes. She asked if I had documentation. I told her yes. She asked if I had ever been diagnosed with cognitive issues. I told her no. She said the next step was to make sure no documents had been altered or moved, and to update my will, just in case. I went home and made a copy of everything. Then I brought the originals to Catherine's office the next morning. She promised to hold on to them securely. That night, I slept with my notebook under my pillow. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done pretending this was still about misunderstandings. I had waited for weeks for a single word, an apology, an explanation, even a moment of doubt in Elliot's eyes. But it never came. What came instead was silence. Polished smiles, soft lies layered with wellness jargon. They didn't see me as a mother anymore. They saw me as an obstacle, and I had no intention of fading quietly. Not in my own home, not after everything I had built, and certainly not for two people who thought kindness was a weakness they could mold into silence. I had been silent long enough. Now, it was my turn to listen, to watch, and to wait for the moment they believed I was too far gone to notice what came next. Because I had already seen it, and I was ready. The house had become a museum of sounds, not the usual kind, not creaking steps or drawers opening, but measured, intentional quiet, the kind that tells you people are speaking in other rooms and don't want you to hear. I began to adjust my life around their silence. I moved softer. I stepped lighter. I listened deeper. And in that quiet, I began preparing. I started in the attic, not the dusty corners filled with boxes and mothballs. I mean the finished space with the cedar chest and locked file drawers. It was the only room Talia never touched. She said the air felt too dry up there. She claimed the smell gave her headaches. That suited me fine. Inside the cedar chest, I kept a small recorder. It belonged to my husband. He used it to dictate ideas when he was designing town council proposals. I hadn't used it since he passed, but the batteries still worked. I started using it in the evenings. After everyone went to sleep, I'd sneak upstairs and sit near the vent that led down into the main hallway. I recorded anything I could catch: conversations about bank appointments, comments about my memory. Once, Talia told Elliot she was close to convincing a therapist to do an assessment visit. She said if it went the way she hoped, they could begin the process of conservatorship by the fall. That word made my fingers tremble, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well. I looked it up again just to be certain. It was a legal authority, control over my estate, my decisions, my name. And I realized then that this wasn't just about my house or my money. It was about erasing me. Every list I wrote after that had 2 copies. One I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. The other I mailed to Catherine's office in a sealed envelope. Catherine had helped me amend my will quietly. She had filed protective clauses. She said we needed to be careful, measured, not draw attention. I trusted her. That week, I also visited my old doctor, Dr. Carson. He had been my physician for 12 years before he retired part-time. I scheduled a private consultation and asked for a cognitive evaluation. He laughed softly at first, thinking I was making a joke. But when he saw my face, he grew quiet. He ran the full panel: memory, reasoning, orientation, reaction. After an hour, he looked me in the eye and said there was no clinical sign of decline. None. He signed a letter confirming it. I made 6 copies. One went straight to Catherine. I didn't confront Elliot or Talia. I didn't change my routine. But now, every word they spoke around me carried a different weight. When Elliot suggested I take a break from grocery shopping, I smiled and agreed. When Talia offered to manage my prescriptions online, I thanked her and said that was generous. And at night, I recorded my voice, my thoughts, my plans. I spoke into the recorder like it was the only person in the world still listening. One evening, I overheard something that made my jaw clench. Elliot was on the phone. He thought I was outside watering the garden, but I was at the kitchen window. He was talking to a real estate agent. He asked about listing a home without alerting the co-owner. He asked if power of attorney could override occupancy rights. He said, and I remember this exactly, that I wouldn't be an issue much longer. The agent's voice was muffled, but Elliot said he'd call back when things were settled. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I wrote a letter to Jude. Not a dramatic one, not a farewell, just a simple letter from a grandmother to her grandson. I told him that if he ever felt confused, if things around him stopped making sense, he should look in the cedar chest. I gave him the combination. I tucked the letter into the back pocket of one of his old books and placed it on the second shelf in the sunroom. He hadn't read with me in weeks, but I hoped he'd come back to it one day. Then I called Catherine and asked her to set a formal meeting. In person. No delays. We met in her office the following Tuesday. I brought my documents, the recording, the new letters. We made a plan. I wouldn't act yet. That would come later, but we would prepare legal protections that could be triggered the moment they tried to take anything. My house, my name, my choices. When I left Catherine's office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Stillness. Not the stillness of being ignored or erased, but the stillness of someone waiting with purpose. When I returned home, Talia was on the phone again. She was pacing the kitchen. She paused when she saw me, then smiled. She asked if I'd like some tea. I said yes, and as she turned her back to the stove, I stood behind her for a second longer than necessary, watching her. She poured the water, stirred the herbs, gave me the cup with both hands. I took it, sat down, sipped it once, and I thought to myself, you may think I'm fading, you may think I've gone soft, but I am watching every move, and I am not done yet, not by a long stretch. By mid-April, the camellias had bloomed along the south wall of the house. I had planted them after my husband passed, during a spring that was colder than usual. I remember kneeling in the dirt, hands shaking, heart hollow. But those flowers had rooted strong, and they came back every year without fail. That morning, I stood by them with shears in hand, trimming a few blooms for the kitchen table. The sun felt warm on my shoulders. Birds stirred in the oaks. For a moment, everything looked as it should. But nothing felt right anymore. Inside the house, Talia was in the office. I had watched her from the hallway, hunched over my desk like it was hers. She kept a manila folder by her side, the one she never left unattended. Elliot had begun sleeping downstairs again, claiming back pain, though I knew it was just an excuse to leave our shared bedroom without questions. I didn't press. I didn't confront. I collected. The recordings in the attic had grown longer. Their voices are more confident. 2 days ago, I captured Talia talking to a social worker on speakerphone. She said I was becoming unpredictable, that I'd misplaced items, repeated myself. She used phrases like behavioral drift and personality shift. She was building a case. I saw it clear as glass, but I wasn't helpless. Catherine had called that morning. She had filed the notarized update to my will. The deed was untouched. The legal backup was ready. We just needed timing and proof. I had asked Daisy, quietly, if she knew anyone who worked in the public records office. She did. A woman named Claire who volunteered at the food bank with us. Daisy invited her for tea without explaining why. I kept the conversation casual, but I asked one thing: whether it was possible to track if someone had filed an initial petition for conservatorship without serving notice yet. Claire hesitated, but said yes. If someone filed a preliminary inquiry with the intent to declare mental incompetence, the record would exist. That evening, she called Daisy. It was there, filed under my name, Elliot's signature. They hadn't told me, hadn't served papers, but the process had begun. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I made soup for dinner. I set the table. I smiled when Jude came in from soccer practice, his knees muddy and his cheeks pink. After dinner, I folded laundry while Elliot sat in the den, watching the news. Talia was in the upstairs hallway, humming. I slipped outside and placed a small envelope beneath Daisy's welcome mat. It held a flash drive with the latest recordings and a second letter. I didn't plan to involve Jude. He was too young, but I left a note in my cedar chest, just in case, tucked beneath the old quilt from my mother's house. At 11 p.m., I heard them whispering through the vent. She said the paperwork was almost ready. He said the therapist was scheduled to visit next week. I wrote down every word. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my writing desk and removed a folder I hadn't touched in 6 years. Inside were photos of the house in its original state, back when we bought it in 1984. Water damage, foundation cracks, the first repair bills, the inspection notes. I kept them because no one else remembered what the house had been, how it had looked before we rebuilt it. I also kept every property tax bill, every receipt from the contractor I hired to redo the roof, the loan payment confirmation from when I took out a second mortgage to help Elliot open his first business. Everything. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because I never let anyone tell me I hadn't paid for something. They could say what they wanted about my memory, but I knew what I had done. By the end of that week, I had scanned every document and sent copies to Catherine. She called and told me, in her calm, clipped tone, that what I had would hold in court, that if they moved forward with the petition, we would challenge it, that she would represent me without hesitation. I thanked her and said I hoped we wouldn't need to, but I no longer hoped blindly. I hoped strategically. On Saturday, I made pancakes, I cooked bacon, I poured orange juice. I smiled when Talia complimented the new curtains in the dining room. I nodded when Elliot said Jude was doing better in school. Then, as they cleared their plates, I sat at the table and said I was considering updating the house title. For tax purposes, for peace of mind. They both froze. Talia asked if I needed help navigating the paperwork. I told her no. I said I had someone already. I watched her eyes flick to Elliot's. She asked when I planned to file. I said soon, and that was the first time I saw real panic in her face. Not loud, not dramatic, just a flicker. But I saw it, and in that flicker, I knew I had stepped past their comfort. I had shifted the ground under their plan. I didn't need power. I just needed proof. And I had it. Enough to hold a line. Enough to remind them that this house didn't belong to whispered plans or quiet signatures. It belonged to history, and I was still its author. The week that followed moved like honey poured too fast. Sweet on the surface, but something sticky clung to everything beneath it. Elliot and Talia started acting generous again. Talia bought fresh flowers for the kitchen table and lit candles at dinner. She made creamy pasta with roasted mushrooms and left out my favorite lemon scones on the counter like a peace offering. Elliot brought home a new book for Jude, a hardcover edition with those embossed gold letters he used to love as a boy. They even invited me to join them for dinner at a new place downtown. It was all too careful, too orchestrated. They were trying to reset the atmosphere. but the warmth never reached their eyes. On Thursday evening, I came home from a walk and heard laughter pouring from the sunroom. Not Jude's laughter. This was adult, sharp, celebratory. I set my purse down quietly and stepped into the hallway. Through the glass doors, I saw them. Elliot and Talia. A bottle of Prosecco sat on the coffee table. 2 flutes, already half empty. A manila folder lay open next to Talia's phone. They were clinking glasses. Talia leaned in, kissed Elliot on the cheek, and said something that made him grin. I didn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I turned away before they saw me. I walked quietly back to my bedroom and closed the door with care. I sat in my vanity for a long while, staring at my reflection. The light was soft, and for a moment, I looked like my mother. The same tired dignity, the same quiet rage. Then I stood, pulled the small recorder from the drawer, and pressed it into my palm. I walked to the hallway vent. The laughter had faded. Now it was voices, low, assured. Talia said the conservatorship filing was in motion, that they'd speak with the evaluator next week. She said something about timing it before summer so the transfer could process before I made any changes. Elliot said he felt bad, but that it was safer this way. He said I'd thank him eventually. I let the recorder run until they left the room. Later that night, I went up to the attic and labeled the audio file with the date and time. I copied it onto the flash drive and sealed it in a second envelope. This time, I didn't leave it with Daisy. I mailed it directly to Catherine. The next morning, I watered the camellias. Jude came out onto the porch with his cereal bowl, still in his socks, his hair a sleepy mess. He sat beside me and asked if we could make cookies later. I smiled and said yes. I asked how school was. He shrugged, said he missed playing goalie. The coach had moved him to defense. He didn't say why, but his voice sounded small. I looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Then I reached into my pocket and gave him a small, folded note. He asked what it was. I told him it was just something to keep, for now, that he didn't need to read it, not unless things got strange. He nodded and tucked it into his hoodie pocket like it was no big deal. But I saw the way he looked at me after, like he knew more than he let on. That afternoon, Talia came into the kitchen while I was cleaning out the spice rack. She asked if I had thought more about letting her handle the estate planning. She said it so gently, like we were 2 women chatting over tea. I told her I appreciated the offer, but I had it covered. She smiled, said she understood, but her fingers lingered too long on the counter as she turned away. The next day, she called in a wellness check. I wasn't supposed to know, but I answered the door when the officer arrived. He said it was just a courtesy visit, that a family member had expressed concern about my safety and cognition. I smiled and offered him a seat. I answered every question clearly, explained my medication list, showed him my pantry, my calendar, even my knitting schedule at the church. When he left, he apologized, said it was clear I was fine. I thanked him and closed the door softly. That evening, I didn't speak during dinner. I just watched them. Talia was too cheerful. Elliot kept reaching for the salt like he didn't taste anything. They knew I knew, but they didn't know what I had. The next morning, I dressed early, wore my Sunday coat, polished shoes. I met Catherine at the courthouse. We filed a formal notice to preemptively block any petition for conservatorship, citing malicious intent and supporting evidence. We included the audio recordings, the document scans, the wellness check report, the statement from Dr. Carson. It wasn't a full lawsuit, not yet, but it was a warning shot. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. Back at the house, Talia was in the backyard, pruning the rose bushes I had planted. She turned as I came through the gate, offered me a too sweet smile, and asked if I'd like to sit with her. I nodded. I sat. We talked about the weather. We talked about nothing. And all the while, I held one thought in my chest like a stone. They were toasting, but I was recording. They thought they had moved their pieces in secret, but I had been watching the board the whole time. And now it was my turn to make a move they wouldn't see coming. Quiet, calm, legal, precise. I had been patient. Now I was prepared. And they had no idea, not yet. It happened quietly. A letter in the mail, cream-colored envelope, court seal in the corner. I was slicing pears in the kitchen when I saw them on the stack. Jude had brought in the mail and left it beside the sugar bowl. I washed my hands and sat down to open it. It was addressed to Elliot, but I knew what it was. An official response. A notice of legal hold, filed by Catherine, approved by the judge. Any further conservatorship filings involving my name were now subject to mandatory judicial review. No emergency claims could be pushed through without full evaluation. The system would no longer be silent. I had forced it to listen. That night, Talia came home with grocery bags. She moved around the kitchen like everything was normal, humming, slicing green onions for the soup. Elliot came in later, his face pale and stiff. He barely looked at me. He didn't know yet that I had seen the letter, but he knew it had arrived. I watched him pour himself a drink with shaking hands. They had lost their leverage. The next morning, Catherine called to confirm the judge had also frozen any attempt to modify the deed without my direct notarized consent. I was no longer the old woman they thought they could nudge off the chessboard. I was the queen they hadn't counted on, and my move had just cornered theirs. The following week moved strangely. Elliot grew distant. Talia tried to compensate with sweetness. I let them. I still cooked breakfast, still watered the camellias, still made Sunday stew. But the air inside the house had changed. On Tuesday, I received another envelope. This one from Catherine. Inside was a transcript, a copy of Talia's original wellness report submission. She had exaggerated symptoms, claimed I'd lost track of time, said I forgot names, burned food. She described my home as cluttered, unsafe. I walked into the living room and looked around. Everything was spotless. My books were in place. The candles were trimmed. The carpet vacuumed. I took the transcript and placed it inside a folder marked Final. I wasn't keeping score. I was keeping a record. That weekend, I invited Daisy over for coffee. We sat on the back porch, sun warm on our hands, steam curling up from our cups. I told her everything, not because I needed her advice, but because silence had become too heavy. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded. Eyes narrowed the way they did when she listened with her whole body. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and said she was proud of me. That meant more than I expected. That night, I sat by my bedroom window and wrote, not in a journal, in a letter, to Jude. I wrote down everything, the dates, the decisions, the names, not to burden him, but to give him a map. Because one day, when he was older, he'd look back and wonder how it all happened. I wanted him to know the truth, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout but stands still. The following Monday, Catherine called again. The court had issued a formal advisory to Elliot and Talia. Any additional attempts to interfere with my finances, property, or legal autonomy would be treated as coercive. They had crossed a line. And now, the law was on my side. Not out of pity, out of proof. Elliot left for work without speaking. Talia stayed home, claiming a migraine. I went about my day. I cleaned the guest room, rearranged the pantry. I even repainted the edge of the porch where the wood had chipped. Every task felt like reclaiming inches of space. That evening, they sat in the living room without saying much. The television played, but no one watched. The silence was louder than anything else. Then, around 9, Talia stood. She asked if we could talk. I followed her into the dining room. She sat across from me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but I couldn't tell if it was sadness or anger. She said she was sorry if I had misunderstood their intentions, that everything had been out of concern, that they only wanted to protect me. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stood and fetched the court letter. I placed it gently on the table between us. I said nothing. She didn't touch it, just sat there, frozen. Finally, she stood and walked out of the room. No apology, no confession, just absence. The next morning, Elliot left before dawn. I heard the door close but didn't get up. When I finally came downstairs, there was a note on the counter. They had gone to stay at a friend's cabin for a few days, needed space. I folded the note and placed it in the same file as everything else. And then I made tea, sat in the sunroom, and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. Not victorious, but solid. Because the court had spoken, and not in anger, but in clarity. They had tried to use silence as a weapon, but I used it as preparation. They had moved in the shadows. I had moved with light. And now, their plans no longer hold power here. The papers had said it plainly. I was competent. I was protected. I was still the owner of this house, not just by name, but by history, by truth, by blood and bone and camellias in the yard. I closed my eyes and listened to the breeze through the window screen. And for the first time, I let the stillness stay. The house was quiet for 3 days. No footsteps overhead. No second car in the driveway. No Talia humming in the kitchen. No Elliot adjusting the thermostat like he always did when the mornings ran cold. Just me and Jude. And even Jude had started keeping to himself more. He'd come home from school, set his backpack down, and head straight to the backyard swing, the one under the sycamore tree. He didn't ask for cookies or cartoons, just sat there, gently pushing off the dirt with the tips of his sneakers. I let him. Some wounds in children aren't loud. They sit just under the skin, waiting for the house to stop pretending. On the 4th morning, the phone rang. Not my cell, the landline. I hadn't heard that sound in weeks. It came from the hallway, the corded phone still mounted on the wall like a relic from the past. I picked it up. Elliot's voice, flat. He said they were coming by that evening, just to talk. He didn't say more, didn't ask how I was, didn't mention Jude. I told him dinner would be at 6, that was all. I hung up and stared at the receiver in my hand. The plastic felt heavier than it used to. That afternoon, I cleaned the living room. Not because it needed it, but because I needed the motion. I wiped the glass on the photo frames, straightened the throw on the couch, lit one of the old lavender candles I had kept in the pantry for too long. By 5:30, I had Jude showered, fed, and tucked into his room with a book. At 6 sharp, their car pulled into the driveway. I opened the door before they knocked. Talia looked thinner, her skin pale, makeup softer than usual. Elliot looked like a man who had run out of stories to tell himself. We sat in the dining room, not the kitchen, not the porch. There was no soup this time, no coffee or cake, just 3 chairs, one truth. Elliot spoke first. He said they had reviewed everything, the court filings, the advisory notices, Catherine's formal documentation. He said they realized they had underestimated me, that they thought they were acting in my best interest. I didn't interrupt. Talia stared at the tablecloth, picked at a thread like it held all the answers. Then she looked up. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard. She said they were sorry, not for everything, but for assuming I couldn't handle things anymore. She said they were scared. Scared of losing control. Scared of responsibility. Scared of becoming me one day. That last part caught me. Because it was honest, brutally so. I let the silence stretch. Let it weigh on all of us. Then I stood and left the room. Came back with 2 folders, one for each of them. Inside were the final notices, legal acknowledgments, confirmations of the court's stance. But more than that, copies of letters I had written. One for Elliot, one for Talia. Not threats, not warnings, just truths. I had written about the day Elliot was born, how I held him against my chest and promised I would always be his safe place. I wrote about the winters we spent curled up in the den, reading aloud from dog-eared mystery novels. I wrote about the moment I realized he no longer saw me as a lighthouse but a burden. And I wrote about how that broke something in me I hadn't known was breakable. For Talia, I wrote about the first time she called me Mom, and how I had smiled for hours afterward. I wrote about the dinners we once had, where laughter was easy and the air didn't taste like control. I wrote about the sting of hearing her call me an old shrew, not because it hurt my pride, but because she said it with such ease, like I was already gone. When they finished reading, neither spoke. They didn't need to. I stood and said what needed saying. I told them they were free to go, that the guest room would be packed by morning, that I would help them find a place if they needed it. But this house, this home, was no longer theirs to manipulate. It belonged to memory, to dignity, to me. Elliot nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. Talia wiped her cheek, not with shame, but with quiet understanding. They left an hour later, no slamming doors, no final words, just the sound of gravel under tires. I locked the door and sat on the bottom step of the stairs, not because I was tired, but because I was full of everything that had never been said, everything that had been taken, and now, finally, everything that had been reclaimed. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat, breathing, because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is not raise her voice, but to speak once, clearly, and let the silence do the rest. It rained that night, the kind of soft, steady rain that hushes the whole world. I sat by the window with my cup of chamomile, listening to it tap against the glass like a lullaby for grown women. Jude was asleep upstairs. The house creaked gently under the weight of the weather. It had been 2 days since they left. I had washed the linens from the guest room, folded them tight. I placed them on the shelf where I kept my mother's quilts. I didn't cry. I didn't miss them. I missed the version of them I once believed in. But that was different. The morning after the rain, I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and saw something at the foot of the steps. A box. Plain. No label. I carried it inside. Inside were old photos, Jude's school drawings, a few letters Elliot had written to me in college, and a necklace. The one Talia had borrowed years ago and never returned. It was wrapped in tissue. No note. Just the past, laid bare in cardboard. I closed the lid and set it aside. That afternoon, I got a call from Daisy. She had heard from someone that Elliot and Talia had moved into a rental on the far side of town. Small place, no garden. Daisy asked if I was all right. I said yes, and I meant it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't living under the weight of hope. That old, heavy hope that they'd come around, say the right thing, be the son and daughter-in-law I used to dream about. Hope can be cruel when it overstays. That evening, while putting away laundry, I found one of Jude's notebooks under his bed. Inside, he had drawn the house, our house, me standing in front, holding a watering can, him on the porch, waving. There were no other people in the drawing. No Elliot, no Talia, just the 2 of us. And flowers, camellias. The next morning, he asked if he could sleep in my room that night. I said yes, not because he was scared, but because I think he needed to be near something that wasn't pretending. After dinner, I tucked him in beside me. He curled up small, like he used to when he was a toddler. I watched him fall asleep and wondered if he'd remember this house years from now. Not just the walls or the stairs or the backyard swing, but the feeling, the quiet strength of it, the way it refused to fall apart. The next day, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Talia. It wasn't long. She said she hoped I was well, that she understood why I did what I did, that she respected it. There was no apology, but there was distance. And in some way, that was its own kind of peace. I placed the letter in the drawer beside my bed, didn't read it twice, didn't feel much of anything. I had spent so many years craving closeness. Now I crave clarity, and I had it. That weekend, I baked a pie, just one. Jude helped roll out the crust, his little fingers pressing the edges just like I had shown him. When it came out of the oven, golden and warm, he smiled in that soft way only children do, like nothing in the world had ever hurt him. Not yet. And maybe, if I did this right, not too deeply later. After he went to bed, I sat on the porch again. The air was warm. The wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth. And for the first time, I thought about the door, the one they might knock on again someday. I knew they might return, with new words, new faces, new excuses. But I also knew this: I wouldn't be standing on the other side. Not this time. Not waiting. Because when someone walks away from your truth, they also walk away from your welcome. And sometimes, they don't get to come back. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you started loving yourself more. That night, I closed every curtain, turned off every light, and slept with both eyes closed for the first time in weeks. Not afraid, not alert, just still. The door was shut, and no one stood waiting at it anymore. I kept the letter from Talia folded in the drawer next to my bed. Not because it mattered, but because it didn't. There was something final about leaving it untouched, a kind of quiet punctuation to a sentence I no longer needed to read again. The house was quiet again, not empty, just quiet. And that quiet had become its own kind of companionship. Jude had started humming when he drew, little half-songs that filled the corners of the living room like sunlight. We planted chrysanthemums by the fence. I told him they were stubborn flowers, blooming right as everything else died. He liked that. The legal parts settled one by one. I closed the joint bank account. A certified letter arrived from Elliot's lawyer, stating he would no longer pursue any rights over the house. I read it once, then placed it beside the letter from Talia. Sometimes closure doesn't arrive with tears. Sometimes it comes in the form of a signature. That afternoon, I opened my closet and pulled out the deep green coat I hadn't worn in years. It still fits. I wore it to the market. The cashier, a young girl with pink hair and kind eyes, complimented the color, said it made me look strong. I told her I was, and I meant it. That evening, I cleaned out the old closet at the back of the house. I found a box of Elliot's baby clothes, a tiny pair of sneakers, and a sun hat. I held them for a moment, then placed them gently in the donation pile. Not everything has to stay just because it once meant something. A letter came from the school. Jude was selected to read a poem during the autumn assembly. He asked if I would come. I said yes. On the day of the assembly, I wore my green coat. Jude stood on stage, small and steady, his voice clear. When he finished, he looked at me, and I gave him a small nod. Not too big, just enough to say I saw him. I always did. That night, Jude brought me a drawing. It was the two of us again, but this time, there were roots under the house, big ones, like trees, holding the whole thing in place. He told me it was our safe place, the one that couldn't be taken. Later, after he was asleep, I sat in the living room. No television, no noise, just the steady rhythm of the clock on the wall. I thought about everything they tried to take. The house, the money, the memory. But I still had this chair, this light, this life. I didn't need a courtroom to declare me right. I just needed to stand here, in my own home, knowing I had not disappeared. Peace isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the sound of nothing missing. I went to bed without checking the locks, without waking at 2 a.m., listening for a car engine or whispering guilt. I pulled the quilt up to my chin, listening to the wind, and I said, out loud, to no one in particular, "They will not write the last line of my story. I will." If you've ever been made to feel like a guest in your own life, if you've had your truth rewritten by someone else's comfort, and if, like me, you've ever found the strength to quietly reclaim what's yours, then you understand. Subscribe if you believe dignity should never be negotiable. Subscribe if you know what it means to walk away, not to punish, but to preserve yourself. And above all, stay for the stories that remind us it's never too late to be seen again.